Hello everybody, welcome to the first of a few mini lectures on algae. Now we're not going to jump into algae right away. First we're going to talk about life cycles, then we'll get into algae and we'll preview algae and give it an algae overview, and then we'll look at some specifics of the examples that we'll examine in lab, and there's an extra credit opportunity coming up of loving a tide pool. Let's not waste any more time, and let's get started. So, when we talk about life cycles, a life cycle is the series of changes that an organism goes through from the time it's created to the time that it creates offspring. Right? For example, this frog started off as an embryo, as a fertilized egg, which developed into an embryo, which developed into a tadpole, which morphed into a frog. And then that frog itself, if it is so lucky as to survive and reproduce, will create eggs, and the whole process will start over again with the next generation. So that cycle, or that series of events, is referred to as a life cycle. So from here on out, we're going to be talking about life cycles on a fairly regular basis during the diversity of life portion of the course. So I want to introduce several life cycles. Let's start with the familiar life cycle, right? Let's look at the human life cycle, which is the general animal life cycle, as in members of the animal kingdom have this life cycle. So we're going to unpack some terminology that hopefully is a little bit familiar to you from your prerequisite course. So let's start with the adult, male and female. They are multicellular and diploid, right? In other words, that every cell in their body except for sperm and eggs has 2 copies of every chromosome, and they're multicellular. Okay? But the cells of the testis and ovary will produce sperm and eggs, also known as an ovum, by the process of meiosis. Remember, one thing that meiosis does is it reduces the number of chromosomes in half. I'm just abbreviating that, reduce number of chroms. Now, in humans and other animals, these haploid cells, right, and their haploid refers to the fact that they only have 1 copy of every chromosome, are referred to as the gametes. And in the human life cycle, the gametes are the only haploid cells, and the only haploid condition in animals is unicellular, because as soon as a sperm fertilizes an egg and their nuclei fuse together, which is the process of fertilization, it creates a new diploid cell. And that single diploid cell is known as a zygote. And so a zygote, by definition, is only 1 cell. As soon as that zygote divides by mitosis, it's no longer a zygote. You have an early embryo. And then that will develop into a diploid multicellular organism. Right? So here it's represented in this kind of simpler color-coded form. Notice how the brownish color on the lower half of the cycle represents the diploid phase, and remember 2N is the abbreviation for diploid. Right? And then meiosis creates the haploid condition, because meiosis reduces the chromosomal number in half. And the only haploid cells in the animal life cycle are the gametes. And as soon as 2 gametes fuse through the process of fertilization, it reestablishes the diploid condition with the creation of the zygote, which divides by mitosis to eventually produce the mature diploid multicellular animal. Now, not all living things work this way. For example, most fungi and some protists, including algae, which we're going to look at today, have pretty much the opposite life cycle. Right? In these organisms, the dominant phase of the organism's life, in other words, the mature individual, is haploid and multicellular. And they will produce gametes by mitosis. And so the idea here is that, and this is kind of the unifying feature of what makes a gamete, is that gametes fuse together through fertilization to make a zygote. So you'll have two haploid gametes fertilized together to make a zygote, but in this life cycle, the single cell, or the single diploid cell, known as the zygote, is the only diploid phase of the entire life, because as soon as that zygote is created, its very next cell division is meiosis, which cuts the number of chromosomes in each cell by half and is going to produce multiple cells, right, each of which are haploid, and they will divide by mitosis to create a haploid multicellular organism. It's kind of like the opposite. But wait, there's more. There's also something called alternation of generations, right? And this is present in all plants and some algae. And in this life cycle, there is both a haploid multicellular phase and a diploid multicellular phase. Sometimes these are actually referred to as the haploid and diploid generations. Now, the haploid multicellular portion of the organism's life cycle is referred to as the gametophyte. Gametophytes make gametes. Right? The diploid multicellular phase of this organism's life is known as a sporophyte, and sporophytes make spores. And the way this life cycle works is that you begin with a haploid multicellular individual known as the gametophyte. It produces gametes by mitosis. The gametes will fuse together through the process of fertilization, therefore making a diploid zygote, which will divide by mitosis to make the multicellular diploid phase of its life, known as the sporophyte. And some of the cells within the sporophyte will divide by meiosis to create haploid spores, that each of which can then divide by mitosis to generate a new gametophyte. So those are the three life cycles. Okay? We're going to end this video here.